We've made things much more complicated than they need to be. So I think what we should do is go right back to basics and think, what's the point of the consultation? What are you trying to achieve? The way to speed up your consultations is to go slowly to start with. Because if you go slowly to start with, so that you really do find out what is the real problem that needs tackling here, it might not just be the symptoms, that might just be the tip of the iceberg.
The UK graduate seems to score well and the pass rate is higher than the ones who are not UK graduates.
Yes, and lots of research has been done on it. When you look at evidence rather than prejudice or assumption on that, it's a topic where it's very easy, to cry prejudice, make unevidenced denials. Such evidence as there is, and I can only speak I'm aware of, which comes from within the college exam, which is looking at for people preparing for the SCA exam now. And some of what those people say their trainers have told them about the exam is frankly alarming. It's actually false. Trainers, please make yourselves as familiar as your trainees need to be with the rules and regulations about what the exam doesn't want, because there is quite a lot of misinformation out there. I know it's in its early days yet, but the college website is very well populated with the only reliable and factual advice about the SCA. I don't think that the answer to the stress in general practice consists of thousands and thousands of GPs going on resilience training courses. That is solving the wrong problem. And if you're under that degree of moral distress, 3 things you can do. Number 1, you can quit. You just get out, cut your hours down and emigrate. That, of course, leaves your remaining colleagues under even more pressure. So although it's understandable, it can't be the answer of choice for everybody. The second thing you can do about moral distress is to lower your own expectations. If part of the grief comes from thinking, I can't do really good general practice under the present conditions, so I'll just settle for doing bad general practice, then it won't hurt so much. That takes some of the pressure off, but it's not a long-term answer. It's disappointing to yourself. It doesn't help the ultimate delivery of good general practice. And I think some of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the pressure towards a more transactional way of working, where it doesn't really matter who sees the patient as long as they get seen by somebody.
Welcome back on the show, Roger. How are you doing?
Thanks very much indeed, It's nice to be with you. It's better in retirement than perhaps some of your listeners might be finding theirs at the moment.
Absolutely. Today, I'm really excited to have a chat with you. We're going to go into what makes a good consultation, how doctors can succeed given the backdrop of enormous pressure that general practice is facing, what tips you can give young doctors who are developing the consultation skills. In your experience, what are essentials for a successful consultation?
I guess that's probably what I've spent quite a lot of my career in trying to get to the bottom of that. Erwin, I think we've made it too complicated over the years. I expect many of your listeners will know and probably be sick of the sound of the various consultation models that have been devised, my own included. And there's mine, there's Pendleton's, there's Calgary, Cambridge, lots of stuff like this. And I think it's important to remember that those all the standard teaching about the consultation dates from the 1980s, which is 3 generations ago. And I think actually as we look back on that, we've made things much more complicated than they need to be. So I think what we should do is go right back to basics and think, what's the point of the consultation? What are you trying to achieve? Somebody who we call a patient comes to you with what they think is a problem. It might be some symptoms or some anxiety or some questions or an emotional state, but to them it's a problem. And they have a 10-minute conversation with you. And at the end of that 10 minutes, instead of a problem, they need to have a plan. A consultation is actually a conversation which converts a problem into a plan. If a consultation succeeds in doing that, of helping somebody develop a plan for dealing with what to them is a problem, if a consultation does that, almost no matter how you do it, then it's a success. No matter how nice you might be, no matter how clinically sound and all the rest of it you might be, if at the end of that consultation the patient hasn't got a plan for dealing with their problem, then it's a failure. That to me seems to be the single criterion. So if we think back to how we get across the principles of consultation to the rising generation of young doctors, it's just a conversation where somebody comes with a problem and you talk and discuss and negotiate your way to a plan. And how you do that in terms of models and types of questioning and how much physical examination you do and how much data sharing, all the other sophisticated stuff. That's the whole point of it. And I think sometimes we get lost in the technical detail of asking about ideas, concerns and expectations and sharing the management and all those sorts of things. The essential point of converting a problem into a plan can sometimes get lost. I don't know whether that's helpful or not. But when we get stuck in a consultation, perhaps we'll talk about that later, the question that clarifies your mind, there are 2 questions. The first question is, am I really clear about what the problem is here? Because it isn't always as it first appears, as you know. It can be buried or convoluted. But to ask yourself, am I really clear what the problem is here? And the second question is, am I really helping this person come up with a plan for dealing with it?
I think that clarity is really important. And can you talk about the doctor's mindset before starting the consultation? Because there's a lot of things that goes in somebody's mind before they start.
Life is so busy in general practice. I'm not in clinical practice now, as you know, but I'm not entirely out of touch with what is going on there. There's so much noise out there. I don't just mean physical noise of the pneumatic drill outside, but there's so much stuff in one's mind about pressure of time and expectations, and am I going to do all right, and all the trappings of general practice. And if that is whizzing through one's mind at the beginning of a consultation, it's really hard to find a kind of corner of your attention to focus on the patient. And yet, particularly at the beginning of the consultation, the single thing that helps the consultation get off to a good start, I think, is for you to pay really good attention to the patient. That's probably the single most important thing. So even if just for a couple of minutes at the beginning of the consultation, if we can discipline ourselves to say, all the other stuff is outside the door. In my own mind, I need to be focused on this person. And I guess the key mindset at the beginning is curiosity. If you can try to be curious at the beginning of the consultation, particularly as to what's going on here. Why has this person in front of me gone to all the trouble, and it's often quite a lot of trouble, to make an appointment to consult with me? What's gone on? What's led to this? What sort of person is this? What might be going through their mind? What's driven them to set up this conversation? For the first few moments, or a minute or two of the consultation, for you to be really curious as to try to unpick that story and trust the process that once, as you begin to listen to the person's story, if we keep our mind fairly free and open at the beginning of the consultation, the right things, the right questions to ask will emerge. We don't have to approach it with too much of a sense of structure. The structure kind of almost forms itself once you begin to drill down into what the person's problem is, whether it's a physical problem or an emotional one or a complex one or a question of relationships. Once the story begins to get told and we start to listen to it, then the appropriate questions just form quite naturally in our minds, because all your listeners will have had at least 10 years of experience of asking patients questions. We don't have to learn how to ask patients questions.
So it's important then to consider the golden minute, as in actively listening to what the patient is saying then, because that's something a lot of GPs refer to when they're teaching consultation.
Yes, it's a nice phrase, isn't it? The golden minute. I don't know where it first appeared, but I think we all know what it means. It means basically shut up and don't interrupt for a bit. It's in danger, I guess, of being a little bit of taken too literally. I can imagine someone sitting there with their stopwatch going, it was silently going 57, 58, 59. Right, now I can chip in. But it's a mindset thing, really. It's just a reminder that if we weigh in too quickly with our own agenda and our own thought process beginning the consultation conform to what we want it to be rather than necessarily what the patient needs it to be.
Yeah. One of the things that some people might do is that they project their faults and make assumptions when they think they've got the problem early on, when they should have listened to the patient and get the story out. It needs a bit of self-awareness to do that. How does one develop self-awareness?
It's partly a question, I think, of appreciating that it really is important. If I were to give you just the naive advice, Erwin, don't speak too much at the beginning of the consultation. You might well say, yes, okay, Roger, I'll try that, I'll do that. But of course, in real life, when it's actually happening to you, all the advice goes out of the window. So in a way, we have to find a way of making it second nature so that it becomes our default position to listen to start with. The first thing that trying to rush the beginning of the consultation actually doesn't save time. It really doesn't. It's quite understandable, obviously, with the tremendous time pressure that people are under these days. Quick, I need to get to the bottom of this and latch onto the first cue or clue as to what's going on here and then pursue that. The danger of that is if you go off on the wrong track with a patient, they will just try to bring you back to the right track. And then you have this little tussle where you ask a question and the patient answers a different question or says anyway, as I was saying. The first step, I guess, is really to try to convince yourself that the way to speed up is actually not to rush the beginning. The way to speed up your consultations is to go slowly to start with. Because if you go slowly to start with so that you really do find out what is the real problem that needs tackling here, it might not just be the symptoms, that might just be the tip of the iceberg. If you spend time at the beginning really going slowly to start with and find out what the real problem is here, then usually the question of devising a plan for dealing with it, which is the second half of the consultation, that becomes much easier because you know you're on the right track. In practical terms, I think trainee listeners perhaps will not want to hear this, but it's a fact of life, I'm afraid, that the most useful tool for doing that is the video camera. And the present generation of trainees, as you know, is going to have to do the new college exam, the simulated consultation assessment, which is a video-based assessment assessment, as they will all know, they're going to have to get used to videoing themselves or consulting on video. In terms of actually how you cultivate and develop your own style, kind of self-correct what might be going wrong in one's consultations, the video camera is the best way. It's a non-critical mirror. People record some of their routine consultations. You don't have to show it to anybody. You don't have to show it to a trainer or a colleague or an assessment or an appraiser or apply a rating scale. Just sit and watch yourself. The best way of modifying one's behavior, if you do watch yourself on a video, is just try to imagine yourself sitting in the patient's chair as you're talking to them and think, what's it like to be talked to by this doctor, who happens to be me in the video? How does this doctor come across? Do they seem to be listening? Do they seem to be caring? Do they seem to know what they're talking about? Are they understanding me? Can I understand them? All those sorts of questions.
That's a really good insight. Yeah, I think recording is really important, but many trainees don't like that idea. In terms of what the things that they can do then to record and then watch it, what are the process when they are watching it back? Do you think there's any benefit in reflection and writing things down as well?
I think if you watch yourself, any lesson that needs to be learned, you'll see the need for it. I don't think you entrench that by just writing it down, particularly unless you write a memo to yourself, dear Roger, shut up and listen, or whatever it is. Watching yourself on video is a kind of halfway stage between being able to watch yourself without a video. And I mean, in some of the stuff in the past, I've tried to get across the idea of it's helpful if, as we are consulting with a patient, if we can simultaneously imagine ourselves to be a fly on the wall watching and listening to what's going on, which is a slightly sophisticated, almost schizophrenic state of mind. That habit of being able to watch yourself while you're at the same time performing, I think that's something that grows with experience. And using the video is a kind of halfway stage for that, because it is just you and not a third person. The rising generation of GPs who are nervous and don't like using video, I'm afraid the message is, I'm sorry, just get over yourselves, just get on with it. You're going to have to do it for an exam. You don't have to show it to anybody. Erase the recordings. Nobody need ever know if you make a fool of yourself. Take self-improvement seriously. I think the video as a kind of proxy for self-observation is as good as you can get.
Are you feeling anxious about the SCA preparation? Maybe you're not getting constructive feedback, you don't know whether you're doing the right thing. If you're looking for one-to-one support, I'd love to help you. Click the link down in the description below to book a call with me to see how I can help you to pass your exam. As we talk about general practices under enormous pressure and the morale is declining, what can doctors do to succeed, especially when it comes to these challenging clinical situations that can be very demanding?
Yeah, it's interesting, that isn't it? I don't know how political we need to get with this at the moment, but I mean, it does seem, from my position as a slightly outside observer of general practice at the moment, that we are close to some kind of tipping point. I mean, I've certainly had in my career, I'm sure you have in yours, you've had days that go badly, where you're on proper form, you've maybe let somebody down or not done a particularly skillful piece of work, and you give yourself a bit of a kicking and say, oh, come on, you can do better than that. But that sense of not doing as well as we might is becoming endemic at the moment. The current phrase, which is a good phrase, I've heard it mentioned many times, is moral distress, of which I think there is an epidemic in general practice at the moment, because we're under such time and expectation pressure, and yet at the same time we know what good general practice should look like, and conditions are just generally so weighted against us at the moment that sense of frustrated disappointment in oneself is really very rife at the moment. I think it is really worrying. We can discuss, hopefully we will in the next few minutes, discuss what the individual doctor can do about it in an individual case. I think we've also got to say that the distress under which general practice is labouring at the moment is beyond the control of any single individual doctor, and that's why we need things like the BMA, like the GMC, like the colleges, to try to take some of the pressure off on a more corporate national scale. In terms of what the individual can do, I think the first thing to do is to remember not to blame the victim. There's another buzz phrase at the moment, a buzzword at the moment, resilience, isn't it? It's a word I don't particularly like. You can go on resilience training courses, which in effect just teach you to greater acceptance conditions which you shouldn't accept. I don't think that the answer to the stress in general practice consists of thousands and thousands of GPs going on resilience training courses. That is solving the wrong problem. Going back to what I was saying earlier, that's the essence of a good consultation, is to solve the right problem. The problem in general practice at the moment is essentially manpower and capacity and not much else. If we had 50% more GPs overnight, almost none of the stress, and we have to make sure that we solve the right problem. That's a long-term case, obviously, and we have a workforce plan now that might go some way towards dealing with that in the next 10 years. But for now, I think I would really want to encourage doctors as to how to deal with that emotional pressure that they're under at the moment. When this podcast will be coming out, but I've got an editorial which will be, or will have been, in the December issue of the British General Practice, talking about this very subject, about what we need to to do to overcome the enormous emotional pressure that GPs are under at the moment. And if you're under that degree of moral distress, there are only three things you can do. Number one, you can quit. You just get out, cut your hours down and emigrate. That, of course, leaves your remaining colleagues under even more pressure. So although it's understandable, it can't be the answer of choice for everybody. The second thing you can do about moral distress is to lower your own expectations. If part of the grief comes from thinking, I can't do really good general practice under the present conditions, so I'll just settle for doing bad general practice, then it won't hurt so much. But it's not a long-term answer. It's disappointing to yourself. It doesn't help the ultimate delivery of good general practice. And I think some of what we're seeing at the moment in terms of the pressure towards a more transactional way of working, where it doesn't really matter who sees the patient as long as they get seen by somebody. I don't think that's the answer, although it does take some of the pressure off. Long-term, and for the individual, I think the answer has to be to do one's best to maintain high standards despite the pressure, and look to one's professional colleagues and professional bodies to try to help relieve that pressure. But I think nothing saps than going home day after day thinking, I've done a bad job. So even if sometimes you can go home and say, in spite of all the pressures, I nevertheless, with some patients, managed to do a good job. That, I think, is a way of keeping one's own self-esteem alive, and I think that has to be a priority for us in the immediate future.
Yeah, I really like what you said. So trying to do our best despite the constraint and limitation. So sometimes we might find that there are patients who challenge our professional values, and we're having to do things that we might not want to. So how do you deal with that in challenging consultation?
So much of general practice is about one's own mindset and attitudes, isn't it? In a way, that's one of the beauties of it, because it does. General practice holds up a mirror in which you can see your own strengths and weaknesses. The first thing to bear in mind is that almost no patients intentionally come into the consulting room intending to upset you. I know it sometimes feels like they do, that you get the feeling that sometimes a patient has got up in the morning and think, what can I do that will really spoil the doctor's day? I know, I'll go along with a list of 27 things that'll wind them up. But people actually don't do that. Everybody, I guess, behaves in the way that they do for reasons that to them at least seem reasonable. If you're a patient who has got an unreasonable expectation, at least an expectation that we think is unreasonable, to them it doesn't seem unreasonable. The first thing to do is, if we can, is just to take a deep breath and think, however irritating or challenging this consultation is, it isn't because the person themselves is necessarily bad or malevolent or trying to be difficult. They're not. One of the great joys of general practice, it does give us the opportunity to get inside the other person's skin and see what it's like to be in their shoes. What's it like to walk a mile in their shoes, to live in their skin, to be in their social setting, their circumstance, with their family and their pressures. And I guess the more we understand the background from which our patients come, the less challenging their behaviour appears. If a patient comes to you and says, the only treatment I want for my condition is iridology, that's immediately challenging in a professional sense, but something has led to that. Maybe they've had bad treatment from an orthodox doctor. Maybe the family tradition that they were raised in. Maybe they've got a friend who seemed to have a miracle worked by an iridologist on one occasion. There's usually, if we can find it, an explanation that makes sense. To some extent, it depends on how far you want to go with this. Inquiring into somebody's backstory does take time. Just on a few occasions in my career, and I count them as successes, the chronically challenging, demanding, the so-called Heartsink patients, they all have a story behind them, which if only you knew that story would make sense and would at least take some of the resentment out of us. Some really challenging patients by saying to them, I'd like to see you by appointment next week, please. I say, yes, I'd like to see you next week on one condition. If you do that, you will hear a most interesting story about, maybe a deprived childhood or an episode of sexual abuse or a change in family circumstances or a sibling killed in a road accident, all those sorts of stories. And even though that may not necessarily change the way the patient behaves, just knowing what the backstory is changes the way you feel about it. They no longer become quite so irritating because you know the story from which that's arisen. How you can get to that point, I think, is tricky, because you can't possibly ask the life story of every patient who slightly irritates you or frustrates you. Then life's too short for that. I think the best technique that I've come across for dealing with lots of these challenging situations is to say out loud, find a polite way of saying out loud to the patient exactly what the problem is, instead of sitting there thinking and getting frustrated by thinking, oh, for heaven's sake, get to the point, I've only got 10 minutes, I can't deal with all this in 10 minutes. Instead of just sitting there silently thinking that, find a polite way of saying to the patient, I've got a problem here. It's clear that you've got lots of things that you want to talk about, and I'm sure they're all important, but on the other hand, I've only got a limited amount of time, and I'm not not quite sure how to handle this. If you find the courage to say that out loud, most patients will help you with that. They will say, in that case, okay, well, doctor, let's just talk about this. And if we've got time, then we'll talk about that. I talk quite a lot about the ability to think out loud, to say out loud what's going through your mind. Because if a patient's behavior is causing you a difficulty, whatever it is, if they know that it is, and it's politely explained to them what that difficulty is, they will try to resolve it. No patient intentionally wants to make an enemy of their doctor. Finding the courage to think one's thoughts out loud, I think, is, if you talk to doctors who've been in the game for 20 or 30 years and say, do you ever think your thoughts out loud to the patient? They say, yeah, of course I do. And most patients like it. It takes a certain amount of courage in the early years of your career, because you have perhaps rather more uncertainty and you don't feel as confident. But the way to develop confidence, if it isn't there, is to pretend that it is. If you need to just kind of play act, what would a really confident doctor do in this situation? A really confident doctor would say to a patient, hang on, I'm not having that. If you can find a way of saying that in a way that's polite and the patient can see is authentic and is not you trying to score points off them, but it's just you just being another human being, that will often get you out of a lot of difficulties. I don't know how practical that is. The freedom to be your natural self with patients is tremendously liberating. Instead of having to play act the role of good doctor, you are a good doctor, just be it.
Yeah, I've seen it working with my supervisor. So when it comes from somebody who's older, they can pull that. But I think for trainees, it might be more difficult because they feel more junior, and calling out a patient on a behavior or something can be a bit difficult. It's a matter of practicing it and seeing what response you're getting and being more comfortable doing it, I suppose. As long as you're doing it in a way that you don't antagonize a patient. And then I think that's something that you highlight in the book.
You've seen your trainer doing it, I presume, was a generation or two ahead of you in general practice. Well, he wasn't always like that. He learned to do that. He's developed that ability to do it. It's a trainable, practicable skill. The senior will benefit from it. I think it does take a certain amount of courage. It's well worth doing.
Yeah. So one thing that you also talk about in the book, Consulting in a Nutshell, is how to use receipt. Receipt is really powerful. Can you tell us more about the receipt concept, Roger?
You've just said to me a two-part instruction. Your first thing was a statement of fact. In the book, you describe a thing called receipts. That's a statement. And you followed it by a request. Will you now please explain? So you are now giving me an instruction as to what you'd like me to talk about next. But the way you made that acceptable and a good idea was because it came on the back of something that you had said, which was just a statement of fact. In the book, you talk about receipts. So that is an example of what I mean by a receipt. In this context, it's just something that you say to a patient that shows you've been listening, or shows you appreciate what's going on, or shows you understand what the situation is. Just a statement of the way things are. But then on the back of that, you follow that up with something that slightly controls, or I use the word steers, the conversation in the direction you want it to go. This is not a medico consulting-y skilly type thing. This is just the way human beings talk to each other. We do it all the time. I mean, you did it just then with them perfectly naturally. Thank you for what you just told me. Now let's do this. I'm looking at your image on the screen as recording. I can say, oh, you're wearing a shade of blue. Is that what you have to wear at work? That's a statement. I can see that that's true, and you know it's true. And I followed it by a question, is that the way you have to work? And you will now then tell me, presumably if we were to continue that conversation, you would give me some information. That two-part remark, giving somebody a receipt, just saying, thank you, or understand what the situation is, but now let's do something different. Something we do all the time in real life with our friends and family. And all I'm suggesting is that it works quite well in the consulting room as well. Because quite often in a consultation, you have a sense of, I need to get onto a different topic, or I want to go back to this, or I need some more information about that, or I'd like to examine you now, or let's have a different discussion. The way to make it happen is to give the patient a receipt, i.e. say something to them that's just a statement of fact, a recap, or some kind of appreciative remark, and then follow it up with a change of direction that you choose. And a bit like thinking aloud, once you've got that as a part of the way you just normally talk to patients, it builds fluency. The format of medical interview that I was trained in at medical school, and I think to some extent people still are, is that the doctor asks questions and the patient answers them. And that's one way of gathering information, but it's only capable of gathering information that is already on the doctor's list of questions. What we want, particularly going back to what we were saying earlier about trying to understand the patient's story rather than just their symptoms, the way to understand a patient's story is to ask open questions of the tell me more, what more can you tell me about this? That is a much more effective way of getting somebody's story out of them than asking a list of closed questions. That receipt technique of saying, thank you for this, but now tell me that, is a good way of building in the kind of fluency that makes the consultation feel to both of you like an ordinary conversation. I don't know your personal circumstances or where you're in practice, Erwin, but I would imagine that you've probably seen and probably had yourself. And if you look at those tend to be the ones where you can't quite see how it happens, but somehow or other, here are two people just having a conversation, and somehow or other, something almost magical happens. Some fact emerges that is transforming. If you look at those sort of consultations in some depth, you often do find that it is just the interchange of truth between two people rather than a doctor asking questions and a patient answering them. It's the two people exploring together a situation, with the doctor obviously having some professional insight as to the direction that's likely to be most rewarding. The more consultations sound like ordinary conversations, the more insightful and sometimes the more helpful they turn out to be.
The flow of the consultation is much better when there's an alignment between the doctor and the patient.
Yes.
And as you said, it's more natural and it's more effective.
I think people are getting better than that. I mean, in my own generation, I was something of an exception because many people of my generation and one or two after it were still trained in the rather authoritarian doctor-centered way of structuring their consultations. And for some patients, that's great. Some patients like and need that steer. But as society changes and social norms, that's decreasingly the case that people want to be spoken and want to be talked down to by a doctor. We want choice. We want information. We want to feel that we're being told the truth. We want to feel that we're being treated as adults and captains of our own souls and stuff. That is now the new norm, and it's the social norm that the present generation of young doctors is now part of. An older generation have to do to share that insight with the rising generation is to encourage them to feel it actually is okay not to act the professional, not to act like the know-all. By and large, patients feel more comfortable with that. Not every patient, of course.
I think one thing that's really difficult for some young doctors is how to manage uncertainty. On one hand, they are taught to be honest and transparent. On the other hand, they are supposed to know as well. How would you say they can navigate that?
Of course, it's a tension. I was, in our previous conversation a few minutes ago, was encouraging people to think out loud and to be frank with patients, tell them as it is. And quite often, if you're early in your career, the way it is you don't know everything. You don't know as much as somebody more senior. You just haven't seen the number of cases. You haven't been around long enough. I remember having this kind of conversation with exam preparation some years ago, and I was encouraging them to be honest and to think out loud and not to be afraid of saying to the patient if you're not certain about things. And someone in the group put her hand up and said, "Well, that's all very well for you," she said to me. "It's all very well for you, because you've had years of experience. But we, at our early stage in our careers, there are lots of things we don't know, and it sounds a bit pathetic. Surely you have to be very confident before you can do that." And somebody else in the group, before I could respond to that, another trainee in the group said, "Well, if you don't feel confident, pretend that you are." And I think that's really good advice, because there is a sense in which general practice is to some extent a performance art, in the sense that the way we say things to patients has an impact as much as what we say. So if you were to say to a patient, "Well, I don't know, I've never seen this before, and I'll have to ask somebody, I wonder if there's anything in the book, I better just go and see if the receptionist can help me," and that all sounds a bit pathetic. Okay, well, if I was the patient, I'd run a mile. On the other hand, you could say to that patient, "I've not come across this exact situation before, and I want to be sure I give you the very best advice, so I just had to go and get a second opinion about this." It's exactly the same message, i.e. I need to ask somebody, but delivered with an entirely different, and it's not conning anybody, it's not a trick, because you are doing the right thing for your patient in getting a second opinion. The corollary to that is it takes a certain amount of bravery to go out on a limb and expose a few vulnerabilities. The almost immediate feedback you will get is almost invariably going to be positive. Patients really do appreciate it if they know that they're being treated honestly by somebody who is another person like they are. Let's say that you look 25, let's be flattering. And if I'm talking to a doctor, I don't expect somebody who's 25 to pretend that they know everything. I know you don't. If you can say to me, "I've not met this situation before, but I perfectly well know how to handle this," that's fine. And you don't lose status, you don't lose potency. So I think that advice, if you don't feel confident, just for the moment, pretend that you are. That becomes self-fulfilling, self-rewarding.
I like the way that you actually made that contrast into the way that you said the second statement and convey that message in more confidence. So something that I've noticed among the early career doctors who are training, the way that they communicate and how they communicate is something that they don't have much awareness. What have you noticed in terms of the difference between the above average candidates for the exam and those who are average and below average, Roger?
Quite understandably, if you're a young doctor training in general practice at the moment in the UK, and you've got to pass the MRCGP exam, and that's now a legal requirement, you can't progress your career unless you do, a driving and a motivating factor in the way people learn and the way people study and prepare. Of course it does, that's inevitable. Some people wrongly think that there is an approved way of acting like a British GP. The way to progress is to act that role. Let's take the hackneyed example. Everybody knows is, in theory, in this country, that you're supposed to ask patients their ideas, concerns, and expectations. The thought behind that perfectly sound. I mean, of course, it helps you to know to some extent what's going through your patient's mind and what their hopes and fears and so forth are. Of course, that helps you as a clinician to tailor your management plan to what they need. If you don't understand that the reason for asking ideas, concerns, and expectations is in order for you then to understand the patient's situation so that you can help with it. If you don't know that that's the reason, you say, well, the reason I have to ask ideas, concerns, and expectations is because the book says I must. And then you ask ideas, concerns, and expectations at the wrong time, or you use clumsy phrases, or you don't listen to the answers, or you don't know what to do with the answers. Sometimes I think it's an indication that perhaps people are not yet ready to finish the training phase of their careers. And of course, there's all sorts of financial and other pressures. There's been pressure from within the general practice academic community to government to make it possible for most trainees to have at least 4 years vocational training rather than 3. If that could be financially not to their disadvantage, I think many trainees would welcome that, because the general practice is increasingly crowded, the curriculum is increasingly crowded, and the expectations are increasingly high. And to get it all crammed into 3 years, 2 years of which, or 18 months of which is going to be in hospital medicine anyway, is proving very, very difficult. And what would be really nice, if that wasn't quite so pressured, I think people would find that they had more time to mature and develop for their consultations, to bed in and become more settled.
Yeah, I think it's definitely something that a lot of GP trainees feel once they finish their training, they still feel like they haven't got enough and they are not that confident. In terms of your experience, having taught GP trainees who are going through the exam, what have you thought about when you think about the differential attainment, when the UK graduate seems to score well and the pass rate is higher than the one who are not UK graduates?
That's a very fair question, and lots of research has been done on it. When you look at evidence rather than prejudice or assumption on that, it's a topic where it's very easy, to cry prejudice or just to make unevidenced denials. That's very easy, and that gets no one anywhere. Such evidence as there is, and I can only speak I'm aware of, which comes from within the college exam, which is looking at different methods of assessing a trainee's competence. In the AKT, the Applied Knowledge Test, which is sat anonymously, there's no indication of background. You can't make any inferences from patients' names because they're anonymized. There is still a degree, but not quite such a marked degree, of differential attainment from different medical schools around the world, and that may be because of different standards, or different degrees of knowledge required to pass medical exams from different parts of the world. Or it may be, in some cultures, doctors towards the less able end tend to be the ones who move to other countries. I don't know. In the consulting skills assessment, where it is possible to see and make assumptions about trainees' background, there is a slightly higher degree of differential attainment, but not that great. Not as great as some of the opponent, the dissenters, would like to believe is true. Some of that, I think, is to do with consulting style. In many parts of the world, it's still the case that many overseas graduates are trained within a healthcare system which is very doctor-led, doctor-dominated, doctor-centered. In other countries, just because of their social systems, or that's for historical reasons, is the norm. For doctors who come from a healthcare background that is doctor-led, doctor-driven, authoritarian, that's done as the norm. They have to make a much greater transition than UK. The people who've lived and worked in the UK, for whom now a more patient-centered style is the norm. It's a much greater transition. They're perfectly capable of making the transition. We know that from longitudinal studies, but it just takes them longer to do it, and that's entirely understandable. That has to kind of feed into the need for greater flexibility in training.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, coming from overseas myself, when I had to integrate in the UK, there was more effort because I had to think through my own language, which is not English first. And then after years of training here and getting accustomed to the culture, then it became almost second nature then. But there is that upfront work in the beginning.
It's astonishing that so many people actually can come to work, particularly in general practice, where most patients will talk to you in their own regional dialects, using their own variety of current slang. And I couldn't possibly do that in another language, fluent in French. I couldn't possibly consult in French that many overseas students, GPs, can consult in English. It's astonishing and admirable. On exam preparation courses, by somebody whose first language isn't English, how can I improve? I don't know the answer. It just has to be, I suppose, to do with it, trying to immerse yourself in the local culture with native English-speaking friends. I don't know any other way of doing that. And I don't think you can't sort of go on a course that will teach you how to understand an East End accent.
Let's talk about in training then. If somebody who is a trainer listening to this has got a trainee who's preparing for the exam what advice would you give to that trainer?
I think is important, because all areas of medicine, particularly general practice, are largely about pattern recognition. Once you've seen a case of so-and-so, you know what a case of so-and-so looks like, and then that makes it easier the next time you see it. If you add up the amount of actual primary care patient contact, by the time you've only had 12 months in general practice rather than 3 years, and of those 12 months, there's some holiday, and there's some study leave, and there's half days, and there's half-day release, and there's 20-minute consultations, all of which tend to reduce the number of patients that you see. The actual experience base of people coming towards the end of vocational training is not really that great. So lots and lots of patient contact, I think, is important, rather than theoretically studying about it. And the video we talked about earlier, if I was the trainer, I would say, please video at least one of your recording, one of your surgeries every week, and don't show it to me. Go home and watch it yourself, then come back and tell me what you've learned from that. I need to know more about prescribing the pill, or it might be I need to stop fidgeting because it's very irritating when I drum my fingers on the desk. Whatever it is that you learned, that's a good habit. And the other thing is, sort of, if there are trainers listening to this a couple of weeks ago from the last of a series of training courses which we do, which we run through the West Midlands for people preparing for the SCA exam now. And some of what those people say their trainers have told them about the exam is frankly alarming. It's actually false. I think as trainers, please make yourselves as familiar as your trainees need to be with the rules and regulations about what the exam does and doesn't want, because there is quite a lot of misinformation out there. I know it's only its early days yet, but the college website is very well populated with the only reliable and factual advice about the SCA. If you're a trainer, I think we have a duty as trainers to make sure that the advice we give trainees is factually accurate. And so I think please know your way around the college website about the exam like the back of your hand.
Yeah, that's really useful. For some trainees who are listening and preparing for their exam, what are the things that you would like to leave them with? Last piece of advice, Roger.
Think ahead to life beyond the exam. The exam hopefully is just going to be one day in your life. And okay, it's a hurdle you've got to jump, and all of you, or virtually all of you, will clear it. Some of you might need more than one attempt, but after that, there's the rest of your career. If I'm talking with more experienced doctors, why do you keep doing the job then, since it's all so bad apparently? Almost all of them will say, well, the bit that keeps them in the job is the one-to-one they have with patients. If you can find a way of making sure that your one-to-one consultations that you have with patients when the door's shut, it's just you and the patient, if you can find a way of making sure that those go well and that you can get some satisfaction and take some pride in that, that's the best immunization against burnout and career fatigue and so forth. Think ahead to beyond the exam, learn how to run an efficient consultation because you need to do so to pass the exam. But more importantly, you need to learn how to run an efficient and effective consultation for the rest of your career, a much more important goal.
Thank you very much for your insights, Roger. And I'm sure a lot of trainees and trainers who are listening and watching this is going to find it very useful. Tell us a little bit about your next book, and then we'll wrap up.
The only next book that's currently coming out is the second edition of the Consulting in a Nutshell book, which I've updated. First came out, that was during COVID. The CSA held sway, and followed by the RCA, the Recorded Consultation Analysis. The new format of the exam, the Simulated Consultation Assessment, is significantly different. I've just updated the Nutshell book. That comes out, I think, on the 7th or 8th of February.
What did you think of this interview with Roger Neighbour? Let me know down in the comment section what was your takeaway, whether you agree with the advice that he gave, whether you disagree, or if you've got any point of view. Write down in the comment section. If you found this interview useful, you might want to watch the next video in which I interviewed Professor Kamla Hofel. Click here to watch it. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.